A voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Hey, new guy. Quit standing around and make yourself useful." The CEO turned. A waitress, a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a forced smile, stood by the counter, balancing a tray full of dishes. "Take these to table 6, she said, nudging the tray toward him. Quickly. He hesitated for half a second before taking the tray. The plates wobbled. His arms tensed. It had been years since he had done anything like this. Back in the day, he had worked at a diner before starting his own restaurant. But this was different. "Move," she whispered sharply. He nodded and walked toward the table. The moment he reached, a customer barely looked up from his phone before muttering, "Took you long enough." The CEO paused for a second before placing the dishes down carefully. "Anything else I can get for you, sir?" The man didn't respond. Just scrolled through his phone. The CEO turned to leave when another customer snapped her fingers at him. "You forgot my water," she said, frowning. He caught himself. He hadn't forgotten. He had never even taken their order. But he didn't argue. He nodded and turned toward the kitchen. Before he even got there, the manager's voice boomed across the room. "Table 5 is complaining. What is wrong with you people?" The CEO turned just in time to see the same young waiter from earlier standing stiffly in front of the manager again. "They asked for extra sauce," the waiter said quietly. "Then why the hell didn't you get it for them sooner?" The restaurant fell silent for a brief moment. Other waiters lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact. The CEO felt his jaw tighten. "Maybe," the waiter said, his voice suddenly steadier, "if we weren't so understaffed, I could have done it faster." A few gasps. The manager took a step forward, his eyes darkening. "What did you just say?" The young waiter hesitated. Then, with quiet determination, he stood his ground. "We're short on staff. We're running around, working twice as hard, and still getting yelled at. It's not fair." The manager laughed. A short, cold laugh. "You don't like it?" he sneered. "Then leave. No one's forcing you to stay." Silence. The CEO watched as the waiter's hands curled into fists at his sides. His face was red, not with embarrassment, but with something deeper. Hurt. Frustration. Defeat. The manager smirked and turned away. The young waiter stood frozen for a few moments. Then, without another word, he untied his apron, dropped it on the floor, and walked out. The CEO felt something in his chest snap. That was it. That was the last straw. What he overhears leaves him frozen. Determined, he turned toward the kitchen, slipping behind the counter where the manager stood talking to a senior waiter. "Let them complain all they want," the manager scoffed. "They won't do anything," the senior waiter laughed. The CEO narrowed his eyes. The manager continued, his voice dropping into a low whisper. "As long as the corporate guys think we're running smoothly, they'll never know. The numbers on paper always look good. That's all that matters." The CEO froze. The reports. The fake numbers. The declining profits that made no sense. It wasn't bad business. It was corruption. The manager chuckled. "If anyone complains, I just fire them. Simple as that." The CEO couldn't breathe. His own restaurant. His own people. And this was how they were being treated? His grip tightened around the edge of the counter. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was a betrayal. And now, he had proof. The words echoed in his mind. "As long as the corporate guys think we're running smoothly, they'll never know. The numbers on paper always look good. That's all that matters." Standing behind the counter, gripping the edge tightly, the CEO felt a slow, burning rage building in his chest. How long had this been going on? How many restaurants? He had built his company on honesty, integrity, and treating employees like family. And now, right in front of him, his own manager was laughing about stealing from employees, mistreating workers, and covering it up. The betrayal was suffocating. He wanted to rip off the disguise, fire the manager on the spot, and shut the place down. But he didn't. Not yet. Because this wasn't just about one bad manager. Something told him this problem was bigger than he thought. So he took a deep breath, let go of the counter, and forced his face into a blank expression. If he wanted to fix this, he needed proof. And to get proof, he had to keep playing the trainee. Thrown into the fire. Hey, new guy. Quit standing there like a statue and clean up table 4. The CEO turned toward the irritated voice. It was the senior waiter, the same man laughing with the manager moments ago. He was tall, muscular, and had the arrogance of someone who knew he had power. Did you hear me, or do I need to spell it out for you? The man snapped. The CEO nodded. He knew how to pick his battles. Without a word, he grabbed a cloth and a tray and headed to table 4. As he reached the table, he saw the same middle-aged waitress from earlier. The one who had quietly helped him on his first task. She glanced up at him with tired, weary eyes. Move quickly, she murmured under her breath. They're watching you. He didn't react, but her words made his stomach tighten. So they were suspicious already. Harsh realities. As the CEO wiped down the table, he couldn't help but observe the other employees. A young teenage waiter, carrying a tray that looked far too heavy for him. A single mother waitress, sneaking a sip of water in the corner before the manager caught her. A busboy, barely out of high school, rubbing his temples, exhausted from working back-to-back shifts. None of them smiled. None of them looked happy. This wasn't a restaurant. It was a prison. And yet, customers had no idea. They enjoyed their expensive meals, laughed with their friends, and walked out satisfied, while the people serving them suffered in silence. How had it come to this? A shocking discovery. Just as the CEO finished wiping the table, a voice snapped at him. Trainee. Get your head out of the clouds and come here. It was the manager. The CEO turned and forced himself to stay calm. Yes, sir? Take this to table 12, the manager ordered, shoving a bill into his hand. And tell them it's cash only. The CEO frowned. Cash only? That wasn't company policy. At all of his restaurants, customers had the choice to pay however they wanted. We don't take cards, the CEO asked carefully. The manager's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you questioning me, newbie? The CEO hesitated. He had to tread carefully. No, sir. Good. Now go. The CEO nodded and walked toward the table, but his mind was spinning. Why was the manager forcing cash payments? Where was that money going? Something was very, very wrong. A friend in the shadows. As the CEO delivered the bill, he noticed the middle-aged waitress watching him from across the room. She had been eyeing him ever since he arrived. When she caught his gaze, she motioned toward the back hallway. The CEO hesitated. Was she trying to warn him? Taking a risk, he nodded subtly. And as soon as the manager's back was turned, he slipped into the hallway after her. The truth begins to unfold. In the dimly lit hallway, the waitress stood near a storage room, her expression serious. You're not just a regular trainee, are you? She whispered. The CEO's heart pounded. Why do you say that? He asked, keeping his voice low. The waitress crossed her arms. You're too observant. You ask too many questions. And most of all, you actually care. She took a deep breath. I don't know who you are. But if you're here to help, you need to know what's really happening. The CEO leaned in. What do you mean? The waitress glanced around, making sure they were alone. Then she whispered, they're stealing from the company. The CEO felt a chill crawl down his spine. What? The manager and his little group, she explained. They force cash payments, then they pocket the money. They overcharge customers and take the extra. They cut wages, make people pay for their own uniforms, and threaten to fire anyone who complains. Her voice dropped lower. They even change the inventory reports. That's why the corporate numbers don't match reality. The CEO felt sick. Everything suddenly made sense. The fake numbers. The declining profits. The employee complaints. It wasn't bad business. It was theft. And the worst part? The company had no idea. The moment that changed everything. The CEO's mind raced. If this was happening here, was it happening at other locations too? Was this just one corrupt manager? Or was this a system-wide operation? How deep did this go? He needed more proof. He needed to catch them in the act. But before he could speak, the waitress grabbed his arm. "You need to be careful," she whispered urgently. "People who ask too many questions don't last here." The CEO swallowed hard. For the first time, he realized he was in real danger. If the manager found out who he really was, there was no telling what he might do. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about survival. The CEO's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had suspected something was wrong the moment he stepped into the restaurant. But now, standing in the dimly lit back hallway, listening to the waitress lay out the horrifying details, he realized the truth was far worse than he could have imagined. This wasn't just mismanagement or employee mistreatment. This was a criminal operation. He forced himself to stay calm. "I need details," he whispered. "How long has this been happening?" The waitress hesitated, scanning his face. "Too long," she said finally. "The manager took over a year ago. Things got bad fast. At first, it was just minor stuff, keeping the tips, cutting hours. Then he got greedy." She leaned in. "He started changing inventory reports, making food disappear so he could sell it himself. Then he forced the cash-only rule. Everything extra goes straight into his pocket. The corporate office never noticed because, well, on paper, everything looks fine." The CEO clenched his jaw. "And I've been blind to it this whole time." The waitress glanced toward the dining area. "If you're smart, you'll quit before you get caught up in it." The CEO met her gaze. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Instead, he straightened and said, "Thanks for the warning." She sighed. "Just be careful." Then she walked away. The CEO exhaled slowly. He wasn't going anywhere. Playing the game. The rest of the shift was a living nightmare. The CEO had worked long hours before. He had started his career in a diner, scrubbing dishes, running tables, doing whatever it took. He wasn't afraid of hard work. But this was something else. The manager barked orders, belittling employees at every turn. The kitchen staff worked like machines, barely getting a break. The youngest waiter, probably no older than 18, collapsed in exhaustion, only to be told to get up or get out. The CEO forced himself to keep his head down, observe, and gather evidence. Every time the manager forced a cash payment, he mentally recorded the amount. Every time an employee was mistreated, he took note. And then, just before closing, he got the break he needed. A conversation that changed everything. The restaurant was nearly empty. The last few customers were finishing their meals. The CEO wiped down a table near the kitchen, moving slowly, deliberately. He needed to stay within earshot. And then, it happened. The manager leaned against the counter, talking to the senior waiter. "Big night," the senior waiter smirked. The manager chuckled. "Easy money. Corporate has no idea how much extra we're making." The CEO's ears pricked. "Are you sure no one's suspicious?" the senior waiter asked. The manager rolled his eyes. "You think corporate actually cares? As long as their reports look good, they won't look deeper. And even if they do, I've got the numbers covered." He patted his pocket. Got tonight's cut right here. A few thousand easy. The CEO's breath hitched. A few thousand. In one night. Multiply that across weeks, months. How much had this man stolen? The senior waiter laughed. And if any of the idiots here figure it out? The manager shrugged. Fire them. Replace them. Simple. The CEO gripped the cloth in his hands so tightly his knuckles turned white. That was it. That was the final piece of proof he needed. A risky move. Now, he had a choice. 1. Reveal himself now. Confront the manager and end it. 2. Wait, gather more proof, and find out if this corruption went beyond just one restaurant. He chose option 2. If the manager had gotten away with this for over a year, there was a chance other locations were doing the same. If he acted too soon, he might only fix one restaurant while the others kept suffering. He had to be patient. But patience came at a cost. Because the longer he stayed undercover, the greater the danger. The manager's test. As the CEO cleared another table, the manager suddenly turned to him. You, he barked. The CEO looked up, keeping his face blank. Yes, sir? You've been here a full shift now. The manager studied him. What do you think? The CEO chose his words carefully. It's intense, he said honestly. The manager smirked. You'll get used to it. Then his eyes narrowed. But tell me, do you like money? The CEO's heart skipped. He knew what this was. A test. This was the manager's way of figuring out if he could be trusted. The CEO forced a grin. Who doesn't? The manager chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. Good answer. Keep your head down, do what you're told, and you might go far here. The CEO nodded. I'll keep that in mind. But inside? He was counting the days until he could destroy this man. A hard night. By the time the shift ended, the CEO felt like he had been hit by a truck. His muscles ached from carrying trays. His feet throbbed from standing for hours. His head pounded from holding back his anger. As he walked toward the locker room to return his apron, he saw the single mother waitress rubbing her temples, exhaustion written all over her face. He hesitated, then walked over. Hey, he said. Long night? She let out a dry laugh. Aren't they all? The CEO frowned. How long have you been working here? 6 years. His stomach dropped. 6 years. And yet, she looked no better off than the struggling trainee she was talking to. Have things always been this bad? He asked. She hesitated. No, she said quietly. It used to be, hard, but fair. Now? She exhaled. Now it's just survival. The CEO's chest tightened. 6 years of work, and she was barely making ends meet. That wasn't just bad business. That was inhumane. A late-night meeting. As he left the restaurant, he spotted the middle-aged waitress who had warned him earlier. She was leaning against the side of the building, smoking a cigarette. When she saw him, she exhaled a cloud of smoke and muttered, "You survived your first day." The CEO chuckled dryly. Barely. She studied him. You're not quitting, are you? No. A pause. Then, finally, she nodded. Then there's something you should know. The CEO frowned. What is it? She flicked the cigarette to the ground and crushed it under her heel. You're not the only one watching. The CEO stiffened. What? She looked around, lowering her voice. I've seen corporate men here before. Guys in suits. Checking reports. Taking notes. They knew something was off. But then? She met his gaze. They disappeared. A chill ran down the CEO's spine. You're saying, corporate knew? I don't know, she admitted. But I know this, you're not the first to ask questions. And the ones who did? She exhaled slowly. They never came back. The stakes just got higher. The CEO felt a deep, gut-wrenching realization sink in. If corporate had already sent investigators, and they had vanished without a trace, then this wasn't just a restaurant problem. This was bigger than he ever imagined. He wasn't just dealing with a greedy manager. He was dealing with something much darker. And now? He was right in the middle of it. The CEO walked away from the restaurant that night with a storm brewing inside him. Before going undercover, he had expected bad management, maybe some financial mishandling. But this? This was organized theft. Exploitation. A toxic system designed to keep employees in fear. And now, he had a disturbing new question to answer. Had corporate already suspected this? If so, why had they done nothing? Had the company he built with his own hands been infiltrated by greedy executives who turned a blind eye, or worse, were involved? His gut told him the corruption didn't stop with just this restaurant. But before making his next move, he needed undeniable proof. Proof that no one, no manager, no executive, no corporate lawyer, could cover up. And that meant he had to go back. A new day, a new plan. The next morning, the CEO woke up sore. His arms ached from lifting trays. His legs throbbed from standing for hours. His mind raced from everything he had learned. But he couldn't stop now. He arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes before his shift. Employees trudged inside, their faces heavy with exhaustion, lifeless, like prisoners reporting for duty. The manager, of course, looked refreshed. Well rested. Like a man who never had to lift a finger yet reaped all the rewards. The CEO clenched his jaw. Not for much longer. A dangerous conversation. Before starting his shift, he found the middle-aged waitress, the one who had warned him the night before. She was setting up silverware, moving mechanically, her face expressionless. "Hey," the CEO said quietly. She glanced up, wary. "You're back." "I told you I wasn't quitting," he replied. She sighed, shaking her head. "Then you're either very brave, or very stupid." The CEO hesitated. Then, carefully, he asked. "You said others have asked questions before. What happened to them?" The waitress stiffened. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she set the silverware down and looked at him. "Some were fired." "That was the best-case scenario," she said, voice low. "But a few just disappeared." The CEO frowned. "Disappeared?" "They were transferred. Sent to other locations. But no one ever heard from them again." The CEO's stomach twisted. This was worse than he thought. It wasn't just this one restaurant. This was a cover-up. A system-wide operation designed to silence anyone who got too close. A shocking find. Later that afternoon, the CEO managed to sneak into the storage room under the pretense of restocking supplies. What he really needed? To check the inventory reports. If the manager was stealing food and reselling it, he needed to find the paper trail. He dug through the old logbooks, scanning the numbers. And then, he found it. The orders didn't match the deliveries. Each week, the reports showed 100 pounds of high-quality steak being delivered. But the restaurant never sold that much. Where was the extra meat going? Then he saw another red flag. The seafood inventory was off. Large amounts of shrimp and lobster were ordered but never showed up on menus or customer receipts. This wasn't just employee exploitation. This was food theft on a massive scale. And someone was covering it up. Caught in the act. Just as he was about to take photos of the logbook, the storage room door creaked open. The CEO barely had time to shut the book and shove it back onto the shelf. A voice sneered, "What do you think you're doing?" The senior waiter. The man towered over him, arms crossed. For a split second, the CEO thought fast. I was looking for more napkins, he said, keeping his voice casual. Manager told me to restock the tables. The senior waiter narrowed his eyes. You're nosy. The CEO forced a sheepish chuckle. Just trying to learn the ropes. The man stared at him for another moment. Then he gave a short, cold laugh. Careful, newbie. Ask too many questions, and you might not like the answers. And then he turned and walked away. The CEO let out a slow breath. That was close. Too close. He needed to move faster. Undercover surveillance. That night, after the restaurant closed, the CEO hid in the back parking lot. He needed to know where the stolen food and cash were going. For hours, nothing happened. Employees left one by one. The manager locked the front doors. Then, at midnight, 2 black vans pulled up. Suspicious. The CEO ducked behind a dumpster, watching as 2 men stepped out and began loading unmarked boxes into the van. Not food shipments. Not restaurant supplies. Something else. The manager came out, shaking hands with one of the men. The CEO strained to hear. Same deal as always? The driver asked. The manager nodded. Keep it quiet. I'll have the next batch ready by Friday. The driver handed him an envelope. Cash. The CEO's chest tightened. They were selling stolen goods under the table. This wasn't just theft. This was organized crime. And now? He had proof. Time for a plan. The next day, the CEO made a decision. He needed to move fast, before they figured out he was onto them. Step 1, gather solid evidence, video, audio, paperwork. Step 2, report it to the highest level of corporate. Step 3, ensure the manager, senior waiter, and anyone else involved were fired and prosecuted. But he wasn't just thinking about this one restaurant anymore. What if this was happening across multiple locations? If so, he had a much bigger fight ahead. And something told him. The real battle was only just beginning. A dangerous offer. That afternoon, the CEO was called into the manager's office. He stepped inside, keeping his expression neutral. The manager leaned back in his chair, studying him. You've done well this week, he said slowly. The CEO nodded. Thank you, sir. The manager smirked. You ever think about moving up? The CEO's stomach tightened. What do you mean? The manager leaned forward. I could use a guy like you. Smart. Hardworking. Knows how to keep his mouth shut. He tapped his desk. I pay my people well. Better than corporate does. The CEO feigned hesitation. I don't know. The manager grinned. Think about it. You could make real money. He slid a thick envelope across the desk. The CEO opened it. Cash. Thousands. It took everything in him to keep his face blank. The manager raised an eyebrow. So, are you in? The final decision. The CEO stared at the envelope. He had seen corruption before. But never like this. He had everything he needed. The stolen food operation. The forced cash payments. The missing employees. The bribery. It was time. He closed the envelope, set it back on the desk, and stood up. I'll think about it, he said. The manager smirked. Good. You have until Friday. The CEO nodded. Then he walked out the door, heart pounding. Because in 2 days, he was taking the whole operation down. The CEO walked out of the manager's office, the weight of the envelope still fresh in his mind. Thousands of dollars, bribe money, hush money. A final test to see if he would fold. He had played his role well. But now, time was running out. 2 days. That's all he had left before Friday, the night when the next batch of stolen goods would be exchanged. That was his window to bring everything down. But as he stepped back into the restaurant, something didn't feel right. The air was too tense. The other employees barely met his eyes. The middle-aged waitress who had been helping him? She was avoiding him completely. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And then, "New guy. Get in here." The manager's voice boomed across the restaurant. The CEO turned, keeping his face neutral. But his gut twisted. Something told him his cover was blown. A public humiliation. The entire restaurant went silent as the CEO stepped forward. The manager stood near the counter, arms crossed. His face was a mask of amusement, but his eyes were ice cold. The senior waiter stood beside him, smirking. The CEO stopped a few feet away. "Yes, sir?" The manager tilted his head. "Tell me something, newbie." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. The CEO's heart skipped. The manager tapped the screen and turned it around. A grainy video played. The CEO recognized the footage immediately. It was him in the storage room, flipping through the inventory books. His stomach plummeted. The senior waiter chuckled. "Looks like someone's been snooping." A ripple of murmurs spread through the employees. Some looked shocked, others looked away. The middle-aged waitress, his only real ally, had a look of pure regret on her face. She had warned him, hadn't she? People who ask too many questions don't last here. The manager pocketed the phone and stepped forward, lowering his voice so only the CEO could hear. "I don't know who you really are," he murmured, "but I know a rat when I see one." The CEO didn't flinch. His heart pounded. His muscles tensed. But he stayed calm. The manager smirked, stepping back and raising his voice for everyone to hear. "You know what I can't stand," he said loudly. "Thieves." He gestured toward the CEO. "And this guy? Caught him in my storage room. Going through my records." A few employees gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably. "He thinks he's smart," the manager went on, circling the CEO like a predator. "Thinks he can walk in here and take what isn't his. Well, guess what?" He stopped in front of him. Then he ripped off the CEO's apron and threw it on the ground. "You're fired." The room stilled. The senior waiter grinned. The middle-aged waitress closed her eyes. The CEO stood frozen. Then, after a moment, he let out a slow breath. He had two choices. He could fight back now, reveal who he really was, and try to fix everything on the spot. Or he could walk away. Walk away, but strike when they least expected it. So he nodded once. Then he turned around and walked out the front door. The real battle begins. The moment the CEO stepped outside, he felt the cold air hit his skin. For the first time in his entire career, he had just been fired from his own company. His fists clenched. He had been so close. Too close. Somehow, they had found out. Someone had been watching him, recording him, waiting for him to slip up. And now? They thought they had won. But they were wrong. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. It was time to go to war. Calling for backup. The CEO walked 3 blocks away before pulling out his phone. He dialed a number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Sir?" "It's me," the CEO said. "We have a problem." A pause. Then, "Tell me everything." And so, he did. He told his most trusted corporate investigator everything, about the stolen food, the fake reports, the forced cash payments, the bribery, the employees living in fear. And when he finished, his investigator let out a slow whistle. "This is bigger than just one restaurant." "I know," the CEO said. "And I want every location checked." A pause. Then, "It's going to get messy." The CEO's grip tightened around the phone. "Good. The setup. For the next 24 hours, the CEO worked in the shadows. While the corrupt manager and his team thought they had won, he was preparing to destroy them. He had lawyers reviewing every financial document. He had corporate investigators checking surveillance tapes. He had auditors analyzing bank records, tracking missing inventory, and cross-checking sales. He had police liaisons ready to step in the moment he gave the word. And the best part? He had a plan for Friday night, the night of the next illegal exchange. The manager had said the next batch will be ready by Friday. Well, the CEO planned to be there. But this time, he wouldn't be alone. Friday night, the sting operation. The CEO sat in an unmarked black car, parked across the street from the restaurant. Beside him sat his lead investigator. Behind them? 3 police cars, engines silent. Officers waiting. Inside the restaurant, the manager had no idea what was coming. At exactly midnight, the black vans arrived. Right on schedule. The CEO watched as the same 2 men stepped out, greeted the manager, and began loading stolen goods into the vans. A few employees stood near the doorway, watching nervously. They knew. They had always known. The CEO glanced at the investigator and nodded once. It was time. Justice is served. The restaurant door slammed open. Police officers flooded in. Hands in the air. Nobody move. Chaos erupted. The manager spun around, eyes wide with shock. What the? The CEO stepped inside. His eyes met the manager's. And for the first time ever, the manager looked afraid. The CEO took a slow step forward. Surprise, he said. The manager's face drained of color. Then the handcuffs clicked. The manager, the senior waiter, and the van drivers were all arrested on the spot. Employees watched in stunned silence. Some whispered. Others smiled. And the CEO? He watched as the nightmare finally ended. A new beginning. The next morning, the CEO walked back into the restaurant. This time, not as a trainee. Not undercover. But as the rightful owner. The employees stared in shock as he stepped forward. Then he spoke. I owe you all an apology, he said. I trusted the wrong people. I let them run this place into the ground. But that ends today. A ripple of murmurs. One employee, the single mother waitress, wiped away tears. And for the first time, the CEO saw something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Real hope. Because this restaurant? It wasn't just his business. It was their livelihood. Their second home. Their future. And now? It was finally safe. The restaurant, once a place of fear and corruption, was now filled with an eerie silence. The manager, the senior waiter, and the van drivers had been arrested in front of everyone. For the first time in over a year, the employees didn't have to tiptoe around their workplace, afraid of getting fired for speaking up. But the fight wasn't over. Because while the local criminals were caught, the CEO knew this problem ran deeper. He had spent years trusting his corporate team. But now, a dangerous question burned in his mind. Did someone in corporate know this was happening? And if so, were they covering it up? He had one final mission before he could set things right. Expose every last person who let this corruption happen. A surprising reaction. After the arrests, the CEO called for an emergency meeting at the restaurant the next morning. Employees shuffled in, their faces a mix of hope and hesitation. They had spent months, even years, living under toxic management. It wasn't easy to believe things would change overnight. The CEO stood at the center of the room. This time, not as a disguised trainee. Not as an observer. But as the leader they deserved. He took a deep breath and spoke. I know you all have questions, he said. So let me start with the truth. I am not a trainee. I'm the CEO of this company. Gasps. A few employees' jaws literally dropped. The middle-aged waitress who had warned him? She simply crossed her arms and gave a knowing nod. The single mother waitress wiped a tear from her eye. I came here because I suspected something was wrong, the CEO continued. I had no idea how bad it truly was. What I saw, what I experienced alongside you, was unacceptable. He let the words sink in. I failed you. I trusted the wrong people to run this place, and you paid the price for it. His voice hardened. But that ends now. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. For the first time, the employees saw something different in their CEO. He wasn't just some rich businessman who sat in an office all day. He had walked in their shoes. And now, he was fighting for them. Fixing the damage. One by one, the employees began speaking up. The young teenage waiter finally admitted that he had been working overtime without pay. The veteran cook revealed how the manager stole kitchen supplies and forced staff to cover the cost. The busboy, barely 18 years old, confessed that he had been threatened with losing his job if he complained. The CEO listened carefully, taking notes. This wasn't just about punishing the bad guys. This was about making sure no one like them ever took power again. He made several announcements on the spot. White heavy checkmark: all stolen wages would be reimbursed immediately. White heavy checkmark: employees who were unfairly fired would be invited back with full benefits. White heavy checkmark: the restaurant's work policies would be restructured, no more unpaid overtime, no more toxic leadership. White heavy checkmark: any employee who wanted to report misconduct could now speak directly to him, no middlemen, no cover-ups. For the first time, smiles returned to the employees' faces. For the first time, they felt heard. But the CEO knew, this was just step one. Because now, he had to deal with the people at the very top. The corporate betrayal. Later that afternoon, the CEO drove straight to corporate headquarters. His anger was no longer just about one corrupt restaurant manager. It was about the executives who ignored the warning signs. The financial reports that didn't make sense. The whistleblowers who disappeared after speaking up. Someone had allowed this to happen. And he was about to find out who. Confronting the executives. The CEO stormed into the boardroom. The top executives were already seated, dressed in impeccable suits, sipping expensive coffee. For years, these men had been his trusted advisors. But today? Today, they were suspects. One of the senior executives leaned back in his chair. Sir, we weren't expecting you. The CEO didn't sit. I just shut down a criminal operation in one of our restaurants, he said coldly. Tell me, how did none of you notice it? The room went silent. Then the chief financial officer cleared his throat. Sir, I assure you, we had no idea. Don't lie to me, the CEO snapped. I've seen the financial records. I know the reports were manipulated. Someone covered this up. Who was it? Silence. The executives glanced at each other. And then? The chief operating officer finally spoke. There was a mistaken oversight, he said carefully. Certain reports didn't make it to your desk. The CEO's blood ran cold. It wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. How many locations? The CEO demanded. The COO hesitated. The CEO slammed his fist on the table. How many? The man sighed. At least 7 restaurants. That we know of. The CEO felt sick. 7 restaurants. 7 locations where managers had stolen money. Mistreated employees, and pocketed company profits. And the executives had let it happen. Firing the corrupt executives. The CEO stood in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice like ice. You're all fired. The executives froze. Sir, please, let's be reasonable. Reasonable? The CEO snapped. You let criminals run my company. You stole from my employees. You ignored every warning sign. His eyes burned with fury. I built this company to be a place of honesty and respect. And you turned it into a breeding ground for greed. He pointed at the door. You're done. Get out. One by one, the executives rose, pale and shaken. By the end of the day, the entire upper management was gone. And for the first time in years, the company was truly clean. Rebuilding the right way. The CEO spent the next week fixing the damage. White heavy checkmark. He hired new executives, people who truly cared about employees. White heavy checkmark. He implemented a direct reporting system, so no corruption could ever be hidden again. White heavy checkmark. He visited all 7 affected restaurants personally, ensuring every employee felt safe again. White heavy checkmark. He increased wages, improved working conditions, and restored fairness. And most importantly, he never stopped. For the first time in months, the CEO felt a sense of peace. The corruption was exposed. The guilty parties were fired and arrested. The stolen wages were repaid. The employees were finally treated with respect. But his journey wasn't over. Because while he had saved one restaurant, he had nearly lost his own company. And now, he had one final mission, ensuring this never happened again. A new beginning. A month after the undercover operation, the CEO stood on a large stage, facing hundreds of his employees. It was the first company-wide meeting since the scandal broke. The air was tense. Employees whispered among themselves, unsure of what to expect. For years, they had been told the company was one big family. But behind closed doors, greed had poisoned the leadership. Now, they wanted to know, was real change coming? Or was this just another speech? The CEO stepped forward. He had rehearsed a long, polished statement. But standing there, looking at his people, he realized. They didn't need a speech. They needed the truth. So, he took a deep breath and spoke from the heart. I failed you. The whispers stopped. The room fell into a heavy silence. I built this company because I wanted to create something different, he continued. A place where people weren't just employees, they were family. But along the way, I lost sight of what was happening under my own roof. A few employees nodded slowly, their expressions softening. When I went undercover, the CEO continued, I saw things that broke me. Employees working overtime without pay. People being fired for asking questions. Corrupt managers stealing while hardworking staff struggled to get by. His jaw tightened. That is not who we are. And that will never happen again. The employees leaned in, listening closely now. So today, I'm making you a promise, the CEO said. From now on, you will never be ignored. You will never be mistreated. And if anyone tries to take advantage of you, they will answer to me. A single clap echoed through the hall. Then another. Then the entire room erupted into applause. Not forced. Not polite. Real. Genuine. Hopeful. The CEO felt something tighten in his chest. For the first time, they believed in him again. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure he never let them down. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, major changes swept through the company. White heavy checkmark new managers were hired, people who actually cared about their teams. White heavy checkmark employee wages were increased, and overtime pay became mandatory. White heavy checkmark a direct reporting system was put in place, allowing workers to file complaints anonymously. White heavy checkmark a surprise audit system was created to ensure no location could cover up theft or abuse again. And most importantly, white heavy checkmark the CEO continued to visit the restaurants, not as a boss, but as a listener. No more corporate walls. No more layers of executives keeping the truth from him.